Why do people in poorer areas pay more council tax than people living in wealthier areas? I'm Rachel, I'm a public and social policy consultant, and I'm on a mission to scrap council tax. Now, for reasons I won't bore you with, I'm a council tax and council tax support expert. And amongst the many, many things that are wrong with council tax and reasons why it needs to go, the one we're talking about today is council tax support. Now, council tax support was introduced in 2013 when, as part of its welfare austerity measures, the then Tory Lib Dem coalition government decided that instead of having a national scheme whereby people living on very low incomes and claiming things like welfare benefits, they could claim up to 100% off their council tax, the government decided to scrap the national scheme for working age claimants, not pensioners, they still get a national scheme, and to give powers to each local authority. There's powers to develop and implement their own council tax support scheme. Now, Scotland and Wales did one thing, they did something different. Northern Ireland, they have different kinds of rates. But in England, we now have 296 different council tax reduction schemes. No two are alike. Some kind of are alike, but really, this is the biggest postcode lottery that we've created since before council tax was invented. And the maximum amount that you can claim off your council tax can vary by as much as 60 percentage points now. The diversion and fragmentation that this has created is enormous. And what we've actually done is baked inequalities into some places and created geographical injustice on a scale that we just don't see with any other national welfare policies. Since the introduction of council tax support, the debt that's owed by us as a country for council tax has boomed. So up to 2011-12, we owed around 2.4 billion nationally in council tax debt, going back to the beginning of council tax. From 2013 to 2024-25, we now owe an additional 4.2 billion. So we've kind of doubled the amount in almost half the time, where we now owe something like 6.6 billion nationally in council tax debt. So in 2013, the government's reasoning as part of its wider welfare and austerity measures was that giving local councils control over how much council tax it collected from poor people would somehow boost economic activity and give them more control over the economic regeneration of their area. It was all a lie. It was a massive red herring. Now, at the same time as introducing council tax support and making local authorities responsible for their welfare policies for council tax, the government also started to make massive cuts to council budgets, and local authority budgets were cut by something like 18% on average per person. But as with all of these things, not all cuts were equal, and in some of our poorer areas, those cuts were as high as 26% per person. Now, I've studied this extensively with a lot of very smart people, and we can't find any real pattern as to why some schemes are designed the way they are and some aren't. So in some areas, you can still claim up to 100% off your council tax. In other areas, you're paying massively, like half your council tax bill, which when you're claiming universal credit is an enormous amount of money, which actually isn't getting collected because people simply can't afford to pay it. Hence, the booming amount of council tax debt that we now owe as a country. The lines that we've drawn are kind of bonkers. So in the northeast, you pay an average of around 10% of council tax after council tax reduction has been applied. But in neighbouring Yorkshire and Humber, that's an average of 22% of council tax after your council tax reduction has been applied. Now, the neighbouring Yorkshire and Humber and the northeast, they have a lot more in common than they don't. And yet we've really sort of diverted and diverged away from this standardised scheme where we've got real drawn lines of difference between what you're eligible for and what you're not. And it's not based on your circumstances. Somebody with exactly the same circumstances living in one borough can pay a hell of a lot more than somebody with exactly the same circumstances living in another borough. It is entrenched inequality. It's absolutely driving geographical injustice when it comes to council tax. The one pattern that we can find, though, is that boroughs that are wealthier, so the richer, better off boroughs, are able to afford more generous council tax support schemes than their poorer neighbours. Wealthier areas are able to collect as a percentage more council tax than areas with lots of people who can't afford to pay. I mean, it's Captain Obvious, but here we are. Because those wealthy areas that collect more tend to have fewer people that need support. Areas which are poorer inherently, they collect less as a percentage of what they need to collect, and they have more claimants living in that area. The result of which is that they can't afford to have a more generous scheme. So why does this matter, and why should we scrap council tax? Now, I've done some other videos on this. I'd love it if you went and watched them, and I'm going to do more about the harm, particularly around debt collection, that council tax is doing. But when we talk about council tax and council tax support, the only relationship we have is with that bill that comes through from our local council, and very few of us actually look at council tax and council tax reduction at a national level. But when we do, we find a massive amount of fragmentation in terms of the way in which people are treated based on exactly the same circumstances. This isn't fairness. This isn't boosting economic integrity or development at a local level. It's not incentivizing people to go to work. What it is doing is it's making it harder and harder for councils to collect money from people who simply do not have it to pay. So what we end up with is more and more draconian collection practices. We end up with a massive amount of debt owed to councils, which is money councils don't have to spend on things like parks, services, all of these great things like education, social care. That's where the money goes. We have those poorer services. So areas with poorer populations raise less council tax as a percentage. So they have harsher council tax support schemes because they can't afford the generous schemes, but then they don't collect that money, so those services suffer, so poorer areas suffer more, and we've got communities circling the drain because of this. Whereas in wealthier areas we've got people who can afford to pay more, so the council collects proportionately more of that council tax, which means that they can afford more generous schemes because they have fewer people living in poverty. And when you've got fewer people living in poverty, you actually have less of a drain on public services like social care, like SEND, like all the things that are costing councils an absolute fortune. Council tax is creating and entrenching localised poverty, and council tax reduction is the cherry on top. Since 2013, we've been making this situation even worse by localising this support. Council tax has absolutely got to go. We need better policy.